City. Jimmy, thanks very much for your time.
My pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you have been involved in many campaigns, and you are a Madison ad man turned political ad maven. And I want to get things started by showing one of my favorite examples of your work. It's from the 2006 Eliot Spitzer campaign, which was your real first foray into politics. Let's take a look.
Remember New York? The New York that all roads led to? That luminous beacon of hope? That big brash promise of opportunity? The state that buzzed and hummed and churned and thrived and shouted so loudly you could hear it all the way to L.A.? If you don't remember that New York, don't worry. He does. Spitzer for governor.
Okay, so actually that was an unusual ad for its time, for New York at any rate, because it had this cinematic approach, but it was reminiscent of the Morning of America in America ad from the Reagan campaign. Why did that ad work?
I think there was a sense in New York State, especially upper New York State, of a lost New York, of what once was but isn't now, and maybe what could be. And Eliot held a lot of promise for people that things were going to change, and I wanted to evoke that feeling in people that New York was once great. Somebody remembers that it was once great, and it can be great again, and to evoke that emotion in people. And I think that's why the ad worked.
Well, and also it took a different approach, right, in terms of, we see a lot of attack ads now, and we'll get into that in a minute, but in terms of the creative approach, it was sort of sweeping and panoramic and not what people are used to in a political ad. Was that new, do you think, for New York?
Yeah, well, I think, I think what's often been traditional in political advertising is people looking at a poll, taking the three top things that show up on the poll, sticking them into an ad with shots of the candidates shaking hands and saying, okay, we've done our job. And, TV is a visual, emotional medium. And you've got to hook people. And especially these days where you have 500 channels and you have satellite radio, and you have the internet, and you have video games, and you have 8,000 things that people can do rather than watch your commercial. I think in some way, shape, or form you have to reward them for spending 30 seconds of their time looking at your ad. And I don't know if that's always the case when they put forth political ads. And my feeling is, yes, you have to give some rational arguments, of course, why you think your candidate is better than another candidate, but there's got to be something that hits you in the gut. Some kind of emotion that grabs you, because ultimately I think people go into a voting booth and they like a candidate or they don't, and I think that's really important. We saw that in '04 with George Bush and John Kerry. God knows at that point they hadn't even found WMDs in Iraq, and there were a lot of things going wrong with Bush. People still elected him, and I think large part because they liked him better. They just somehow he came across as a more regular kind of guy.
Okay.
And ultimately, that's a very important thing.
Okay, so keeping that in mind, these elements of what works in a political ad, I want to take a look at one of Andrew Cuomo's first general election ads.
Okay.
Cuomo has always fought for the people, taking on the tough fights. He was chosen by a president to clean up one of our nation's worst federal agencies. As Attorney General, Andrew Cuomo took on greedy bankers, abusive health insurance companies, and corrupt politicians, Republicans and Democrats. And he didn't just fight for us, he won. Now Andrew Cuomo is running for governor. He'll bring his experience and independence to the job and make our state government work for the people again.
Okay, so what we see there is some sort of dramatic black and white stills of Andrew Cuomo working as an attorney general, some panoramic views of the Hudson River in color, New York, etc. Does that do it for you? Does it invoke an emotion? Does it hit people in the gut the way it needs to?
Well, to be totally truthful, I'm hearing it and not seeing it, so I'll wing it a little bit. But I happen to like black and white stills. I think it gives a certain gravitas. Ever since they did those incredible black and white shots of John Kennedy in the Oval Office, which to me are the most evocative shots ever done of a political figure. And they did similar shots with Bobby Kennedy as well. I think when you show black and white shots of a candidate, it gives it a certain gravitas and a certain drama. and a certain candidness, as opposed to the sort of set-up shots that we typically see in political ads and direct mail, where they're sitting there shaking hands with people in full color. So I tend to like that as well. The music sounded quite nice, and I think what they're trying to do is evoke Andrew as someone who is independent of the Albany establishment, hence you hear that word a lot, and someone who's mature and a leader, which is probably setting up a contrast with Carl Palladino, who is, to put it mildly, somewhat eccentric.
Okay, and to that point, let's see a Carl Palladino ad, because I think that they are stark in the difference, and let's take a look at that one.
There are two major candidates for governor of New York, career politician Andrew Cuomo and businessman Carl Palladino. Cuomo supports the construction of a $100 million Islamic mosque in the shadow of Ground Zero. Palladino says the mosque makes a mockery of those who died there.
I'm Carl Palladino. As governor, I will use the power of eminent domain to stop the mosque and use the site as a war memorial instead of a monument to those who attacked our country.
The choice is clear. Palladino for governor.
Okay, now this is actually a pre-primary ad. It was before Carl Palladino won and defeated Rick Lazio, and the mosque was a little bit more on the front burner. However, what we're seeing here is very stark, and since you cannot see it, it's just headshots of these two guys, and at the end, Carl Palladino saying he's running for governor. I mean, it is very simple, but also taps into that anger a little bit that he has managed to sort of ride, I think, to the top of this race. What's your response to that?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think he's just trying to put forth a very stark, simple argument on what has been an extremely contentious, emotional issue in New York State. If you embellish that issue, in other words, if you show shots of 911, I think you could be guilty of being somewhat exploitive. Because it is a very tricky issue, and there's a lot of emotion wrapped up into it. And so I think whoever did his ad said, I'm just going to throw that argument out in very stark terms. People know what this issue is about. People are already wrapped up with a lot of emotion in it. And I'm just going to say my candidate does not believe in putting the mosque there, and the other one does.
You know, what's interesting is that you managed to, at putting aside everything that we know now about Eliot Spitzer and what happened to his governorship, he had a reputation for being angry and aggressive, and you managed to turn that from anger into passion. So we've got a guy who is angry, Carl Palladino. He talks about being mad as hell, and obviously voters are responding to that. Do you think that he can tap into that in a productive way? And then on the same note, how does Andrew Cuomo counter that in an advertisement?
Yeah, I think he can. I think people are. I remember, it's a different time than when Eliot ran. People are incredibly angry all over the country, and I've been doing a bunch of races from Georgia to California to Oregon, and you just see to Arizona, and you see incredible anger all across the country now. And obviously, Carl tapped into that clearly because he won. And I think it's just a different, I don't think he needs it to put forth his passion. With Carl, you're absolutely right. It's, I'm angry, you're angry, we're all angry together, and we're going to do something about it. If I was doing his ads, I would temper it a little bit by having that anger come forth in a somewhat more mature way, and certainly not an eccentric way. Because you know that the Cuomo camp will be using some of his more eccentric statements over the years to paint Carl Palladino as someone who's just not fit to be governor of New York State.
Well, they already have, but isn't it a little bit dicey? I mean, we're going to get into, at this point, attack ads, which people say they hate, and yet somehow they still work. And you're going to see negative advertising, but doesn't that just play into what Carl Palladino is saying, elevating his anger level and the anger level of the electorate?
Well, yeah, but I think, I mean, Carl Palladino has been guilty of saying some things which I think in retrospect he probably would not say now or would take back. And, I mean, there's anger, there's justifiable anger, and there's looniness, for want of a better term. And I think, I imagine that the Cuomo people will show the more extreme side of what Carl Palladino has said over the years, and sort of paint him as someone who you may not want sitting in the executive office in Albany, anger or not.
Tell me, and just in parting, Jimmy, why do ads work? I mean, people say, you mentioned yourself, now we have so much else. We have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have people get messages from the Obama campaign they get them texted. I mean, why is it that people spend so much on ads in campaigns? Because obviously that's the largest expenditure and independent expenditures now, thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court, that you're seeing in politics.
Well, I mean, ads, television ads still get to the widest audience. There's no doubt about it. They do. And so if you're going to get your message out there and you're trying to get the vote, you've got to be on TV. And why do they work? I mean, some of them do and some of them don't. Sometimes they don't work. You know, I think what happens in this business sometimes, and I'm not going to stand up on a soapbox, but when you have two candidates, whether your ads are good or not, you'll probably win 50% of the time just because there's only two people in the race. So anybody could look at a record and say, well, I've won, you know, 40 races, so my ads were terrific. Well, they might not have been. But your candidate might have been better, or your field might have been better, or your direct mail might have been better, or the other candidate was just so awful that you won the race. Sometimes ads work, sometimes they don't work. I mean, again, I'm a believer that you have to give people a little bit more than just the facts. You've got to give them something that they feel inside, something that they take with them, and give them a feeling about the candidate as well as a sense of what this candidate's about.
Well, we are going to be seeing a lot of ads, a barrage. They are already starting. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's really great to see you.
Thanks, Liz. Pleasure to be here.